Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? Apple's brief flirt with licensing the Mac OS in the mid-90s was meant to grow its user base. And while plenty of affordable Mac clones hit the market, a few offered performance even better than what Apple could pull off itself. In 1995, Power Computing became the first licensed Mac clone maker, and quickly found success by producing computers that offered better value than the ones made by Apple itself. While a lot of these were mainstream machines, the company also had its eyes set on Apple's high-end computer lines, and in July 1996, it introduced the PowerTower Pro. Not only did its performance eclipse anything Apple had to offer at the time, it even beat out many PCs. This particular example is the 225 MHz model, though they ranged in speeds of 180 to 250 MHz. The series was meant to be highly expandable, with a number of front drive bays as well as 6 PCI slots. The back featured audio jacks, 10BASE-T Ethernet and an AAUI port, along with serial, SCSI, and ADB. The included video card offered both standard Mac and VGA connectors, and this machine came to me with 2 additional cards. One features what looks like video in and out ports, while the other offers USB expansion. Since it had received some upgrades already, my goal with this computer was to set it up like how a power user would have in the late 90s. But first, I needed to sort out what had been done already, and this bit of wiring caught my attention. Electrical tape and wire nuts inside a computer is hardly a good sign, but thankfully, this modification was easily undone. Looks like someone simply made a custom power cable extender. At least the clock or PRAM battery had already been removed. When these fail, they tend to leak all over and cause lots of damage. The hard drive mounts vertically to this rail and blocks access to other parts of the motherboard, so I got it removed and disconnected. The backside of its bracket also holds the CPU fan, which I unplugged. The drive itself is actually an aftermarket replacement from a company called APS. They were a prolific Mac parts retailer at the time, and storage devices like hard drives were perhaps their most popular products. APS actually ended up getting into the Mac clone market itself in early 1997 after securing a sublicense from Motorola. This drive is 3.2 gigabytes in capacity. The PowerTower Pro shipped with options for either 2 or 4 gigabytes and was made by Quantum. My hope was that it still worked in order to keep with being period accurate, but if it didn't, I had a modern blue SCSI unit standing by. Power Computing had gone with SCSI in this machine for better performance. IDE drives were cheaper but slower, and the PowerTower Pro didn't even include an IDE controller on board, just 2 SCSI buses. This meant one had to deal with a bit of SCSI voodoo when adding or changing drives, and this machine seems to have had an additional one installed at some point. There was a second unused ribbon cable inside, along with some telltale screw marks in one of the now empty drive bays. The optical drive caught my eye as also potentially having been replaced. A couple of tabs clipped the front bezel to the chassis, then I could get the drive unscrewed from its bay. One final screw secured it from the front, and upon pulling it out, my suspicion was confirmed. This is actually an Apple OEM drive. Apple didn't sell these to the clone makers, though at least it's an 8x drive, like what the machine would have shipped with. The 3.5-inch drive cage came out next, which gave me access to the RAM slots. I was hoping this machine had received a memory upgrade, and I was in luck. Almost all of its RAM slots were full. Macs from this era used modules that look like PC66 or PC100 DIMMs, but are actually FastPage instead, making them much less common, even back then. It's a bummer that these weren't as industry standard as the rest of the system. Part of how Power Computing kept prices down was by using as many off-the-shelf parts as it could, like ordinary ATX power supplies, and if one didn't know any better, it would be easy to confuse this machine for a Windows PC. And like a PC, this machine has 6 PCI card slots for expansion, though 2 of the cards weren't screwed in. The upper card added 2 external USB ports and had headers for 4 more, though the case didn't have any provisions for front-mounted ports, being from 1996 and all. The middle card was a bit more interesting. It was made by German manufacturer Miro Computer Products, and some searching reveals it's a model DC-20 video capture card. These were apparently fairly expensive at the time, selling for around $700 US, and with a video editing software bundle for around $1,500. The PowerTower Pro lacked onboard video, so the bottom slot held the graphics card. This one was original to the machine, but was also a high-end, expensive option for its time, an iX Micro Twin Turbo 128. It's the maxed out version, too, featuring 8 megabytes of video memory, a pretty impressive amount. It wasn't meant for gaming, but rather tasks like graphic design, and since that was a market the PowerTower Pro was targeting, iX Micro featured the machine in its ads. On its own, this card would have sold for $800. The last item to check out was the CPU, which was integrated into a purpose-built daughter card. The slot was the same as used in some other Macs, clones, and official Apple models alike, so it not only made for easy upgrades, but also cost savings during manufacturing. This machine came with a 225 MHz PowerPC 604E processor, the first Mac to do so, and MacUser magazine even claimed it was faster than most Windows PCs. Their explanation was that the 604E brought such a performance boost over prior PowerPC chips that its real competition was actually Intel's Pentium Pro, which was found in workstations and servers. There's a slot just above the one for the CPU, and unfortunately, it was empty. Normally it holds the Level 2 cache module, which on this machine was 1 megabyte. I managed to find a Power Computing branded module, but sadly, it wasn't compatible. The notches didn't line up with the slot in either orientation. This is a bummer, as the lack of a cache will hurt CPU performance, but I'd need to proceed without it, at least for now. Given its age, the machine wasn't actually too horribly dusty inside, though I did clean it out while I had the chance. And that meant it was time for a few upgrades during reassembly, starting with a CD burner, which would have been very common in the late 90s. It's a Sony model CRX 140S, with that S suffix meaning it's the SCSI version. Important since again this machine lacks IDE. But unlike the last time I tried to use a Sony SCSI optical drive, this one has a clearly marked jumper for bus termination, so I was much more confident it would work. And with 8 times write, 4 times rewrite, and 32 times read, it would have been quite a compelling option when it was new. I had found that the CD-ROM audio cable inside the clone was disconnected. Normally it goes here next to the PRAM battery. There were a few different standards for these audio connectors over the years, but thankfully the Apple drive and the replacement Sony model used the same one, so the cable transferred over no problem. I could only hope that the drive's bezel would match the color of the front panel when I got the machine back together. Macs from this era, clones or otherwise, often don't work quite right if their PRAM battery is missing or dead, so I needed to install one. But instead of the original half AA size that's prone to leak over time, I opted to go with a modern alternative. This is called the Meow Toast, and it allows you to use a standard coin cell instead, which are far less prone to causing problems long term. It does produce a slightly lower nominal voltage, which some machines have troubles with, but it was worth a shot in this one. I'll include a link in the description if you're interested. With the L2 cache module missing, I wanted to give the PowerTower every chance it could to perform well, so I pulled out one of the RAM sticks. This is because the machine can use interleaved memory, which is kind of a predecessor to dual-channel RAM. Installing modules in pairs gives a bit of a speed boost, so this extra stick needed to go. It was only 8 megabytes in size, anyway. Next, I got the PCI cards reinstalled. The video card was perfectly suitable, and while I didn't plan on using it, the capture card wouldn't hurt to leave in. The USB card was already an upgrade itself, probably from the early 2000s. Something that would be very handy in this machine is a zip drive, since it could be used to transfer data between even older Macs in my collection. This one's SCSI as well, and had been pulled from another Mac based on the label. I installed it in the lower bay of the 3.5-inch drive bracket, then got the bracket slid back into the chassis. Working on this machine is very straightforward, which probably encouraged owners at the time to take on upgrades like this. I popped out the appropriate cover in the front bezel, then got it snapped back on. Looks like the color match with the optical drive is pretty much spot on, and it's very close with the new zip drive. IDE zip drives used Molex plugs for power, but SCSI ones had to go with Berg connectors to save on space. The power supply in the PowerTower did have one Berg connector, but the wiring was left a bit too tight for my comfort, so I added an adapter cable instead. No wire nuts or electrical tape this time. I wasn't sure what OS was installed on the hard drive already, if there even was one, but once the hardware was back together, I decided to go with macOS 8.5, which had always been a solid release in my experience. The machine powered on and booted from the CD, and the drive setup utility found the hard drive and let me format it. I took the opportunity while the OS installation progressed to give the keyboard and mouse a basic cleaning, and while they were pretty dirty, they were also the original Power Computing branded ones that had shipped with the system. The button on the mouse had been flaky and seemed to be getting progressively worse. It would physically click, but not register in software. This was likely due to a failed microswitch inside, which I decided to deal with another day. So I swapped in a known good Apple mouse for the time being. System Profiler detected the machine's 225 MHz CPU properly and reported the model as being a Power Mac 9500. This is to be expected, as all of the Mac clones were based off of Apple reference designs, which the company also used for its own machines. It also showed that the computer had a somewhat odd 352 megabytes of RAM, though this is explained by the variety of modules installed, which at least were in matched pairs. And as expected, it said that the cache module wasn't installed. I copied a Mac benchmark utility to zip disk using my modern Mac, which would also serve as a good test of the drive in the PowerTower. It appeared to work just fine, and ejected without issue too. So let's see how the performance stacks up using the MacBench 5 utility. I kicked off CPU and floating point tests, and the results were, sadly, what I suspected. Against a later machine with a 300 MHz PowerPC G3 processor, I knew the PowerTower would be slower, but it shouldn't be this far behind. The floating point score is a lot closer to reality, but that's because it doesn't use the one thing this machine didn't have. It's level 2 cache. One of those modules shipped with every PowerTower Pro, so there's a good reason why it may have gone missing from this one. It was commonly recommended to remove it when swapping the original processor for an upgrade card. It's quite possible this computer had gotten such an upgrade at some point that was later removed, and then the cache card was forgotten about. But there is an easy fix for this. Let's put an upgrade card back in. G3 upgrades like this one from Sonnet Technologies typically included a level 2 or backside cache directly on the PCB. And while this 300 MHz module would have given a nice speed boost, I had one on hand that was even more appropriate for the machine. It's a Mach Speed G3 from XLR8, and it's clocked at 400 MHz. XLR8's upgrades were popular with those who wanted the best performance, as they often included a set of dip switches that allowed for adjusting the bus speed and multiplier. The installation manual even gives instructions on how to go about overclocking the card to get the most from it. And while that certainly sounds fun, I decided to leave the settings stock for now, as I was more interested in making sure the machine was stable on its own first. These cards needed drivers in order to work at their best and allow for adjusting settings, so I got them installed and rebooted the machine. The drivers picked up the card and loaded correctly, and the Mach speed control panel showed the CPU running at 400 MHz with its 1 MB backside cache operating at half clock speed. This machine should benchmark much better now. And it certainly did. It's a huge leap from the original CPU without its cache, and about 30 percentage points faster than the reference 300 MHz system. When new, these upgrade cards weren't cheap. Some sold for over $1,000, but they were still far less expensive than buying a whole new computer. And at its launch, the PowerTower Pro certainly wasn't inexpensive. The 225 MHz model, like I have, went for $5,000 US and included 16 MB of RAM and a 2 GB hard drive. Later revisions increased the speed to 250 MHz, and some even came with dual processors. Though that's a story for another time. Power Computing had reportedly even been working on G3 versions of the PowerTower Pro, which would have debuted before Apple could release its own machines using that CPU. But they never saw the light of day, as by that point, Power Computing had been acquired by Apple and shut down. They were biting the hand that feeds. The premise behind allowing Mac clones was simple. It would expand the Mac ecosystem and, in time, allow Apple to shift to being only a software maker. There were two problems, though. First, its tight integration between hardware and software meant that computer sales made up a large portion of its revenue. And second, instead of expanding the Mac installed base, competition between clone makers and Apple itself resulted in a race to the bottom for prices. This was fantastic for consumers, but placed financial strain on Apple. What twisted the knife was that Power Computing wasn't content to sell just consumer-focused Macs. It and a couple of other clone makers set their sights on the high end of the market, targeting professionals like graphic designers and video editors. In fact, I found that the video capture card in my PowerTower Pro had actually been a factory option all along. The drivers for it were on the original restore disk. While they weren't sold in as large in numbers, Apple's high-performance machines had good margins and provided much-needed cash flow. But with clone makers attacking the company on that front too, it was clear the arrangement was doing more harm than good. Apple was heading for bankruptcy. As part of its acquisition of Next to replace its aging operating system, Apple also got back Steve Jobs, who quickly set out to put an end to the Mac clones. Reportedly, the licensing agreement signed with most Mac clone makers allowed them to include specifically Mac OS 7 with their machines. So, in a clever move, the next release after 7.6 was called Mac OS 8, which would thus be excluded from the licensing agreements. New ones would need to be negotiated, and this time Apple argued for much more favorable terms, ones that the clone makers, with their slim margins, simply couldn't agree to. One by one, they ended up dropping out of the market. APS, the company that made the replacement hard drive we looked at, ended up going out of business entirely. It had been owed millions of dollars by hard drive maker Micropolis, which had shipped a series of defective parts that APS had to offer its customers replacements for on its own dime. But Micropolis's parent company filed for bankruptcy, so APS couldn't recoup its losses, and the Mac clone licensing situation was the final nail in the coffin. What remained of the company ended up being acquired by rival accessory maker LaCie in early 1998. But as the first Mac clone licensee, Power Computing's agreement didn't include such a clause limiting the OS version. In fact, as other clone makers faltered, it even shipped some systems with OS 8 already installed. Despite its amusing advertising trying to champion the platform, Power Computing was doing Apple no favors, and the only way to stop it was in the form of a buyout worth $100 million. After the deal closed in September of 1997, Apple sent letters to Power Computing owners explaining the situation, and included a sales pitch only Jobs could have come up with: an offer to buy a copy of the Mac OS upgrade at a discount. So I got the PowerTower Pro performing nicely now, and other upgrades like the CD burner and zip drive were working as they should. Unfortunately, the USB card didn't seem to want to work. A flash drive I've used on other classic Macs simply wasn't detected at all. macOS 9 brought with it much better support for USB and add-on cards, so I figured that upgrading to it would be worth a shot. But despite having all the right drivers installed, the card still didn't want to behave. It's likely due to an incompatibility with its chipset. Apparently getting add-on USB cards to work was always a bit hit or miss, so I'll need to keep an eye out for a better one. Nevertheless, I'm happy with how this one turned out. When new, the PowerTower Pro was an expensive but fast machine, and I can see how owners would find the value in buying CPU upgrade cards later on to eke out a few more years of use. The Mac clones were only around for about 2.5 years, and even amidst the frantic pace of technology in the 90s, that still feels fairly short. But given the impact they had on the Mac ecosystem, perhaps in some ways they were too much of a good thing. A big thank you goes to viewer Greg for donating this machine to the channel. If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. You can follow me on social media at thisdoesnotcomp, and as always, thanks for watching.